Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. What an exciting day it has been. Wow. That panel was just amazing, and what an exciting venture it was to see the design jam. So I'm just really inspired right now. And I think we're all going to be inspired by our next and our last speaker today, who it's my pleasure to introduce. She's a friend and a colleague who I deeply respect. Um, I'm going to introduce her through a few quick stories. I think these capture the essence of Soon Me. We first met when I joined the leadership team at Porter Novelli about 5 years ago, and Soon Me had the office with a full wall of probably 58.5 by 11 printouts of quotes and inspirational sayings and beautiful pictures, and they were all lined up perfectly, about 1 inch apart. And it would make you kind of stop in your tracks as you walked by. Um, and the coolest part was when you came into her office and sat down, it was behind her. So the person looking at her really got to experience that. And they got to see all of really what Soon Me was. She really brought herself to work. It was before we really talked about bringing yourself to work, but she brought her whole self. And she enabled us at Porter Novelli to really start talking in that way. I was also immediately intrigued by the fact that she comes to almost every meeting with a pouch of probably 25 or so different colored pencils and markers. And it's like she's ready to draw you the most beautiful, colorful picture versus really lay down a communication strategy on you, which she will absolutely do. I thought it was amazing that she showed up as she was, and she really used her color and her beauty to tell her story. And that's really stuck with me. And I think it makes a lot of sense that Soon Me went on to become the first diversity, equity, and inclusion officer at Porter Novelli, a role that she stepped right into, blazed a path, and it's led her to even more influential roles at Omnicom, where she's now an executive vice president, and she's the chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer for the Omnicom Public Relations Group, which is a variety of agencies, thousands of people, and she's doing amazing work there too. In the past 5 years, Soon Me has risen to national acclaim. I love saying that, with awards from Ad Color, PR Week, ColorCom, and the list goes on. She is a constant giver to young professionals and a self-proclaimed dreamer and doer, which I would agree with. And I'm thrilled for her to share today what she sees in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we can embrace and really ignite DEI as we move forward into our workspaces after today. So Soon Me, thank you, and it's all yours.
Shelley, oh my goodness, what a beautiful gift I will take with me through your very, very kind words. I appreciate you so much. I'm really excited to be with you all here today, and just honored to be a part of this very, very important group and what you all have been experiencing over these last 2 days. If you will just bear with me just a moment, I am going to share my screen so that you'll have a little bit of visual aid besides just my face. So if you'll just give me a moment, I will attempt to do that. 1 second, please. All right. Hopefully you all can see that, and I'm going to assume yes, unless I see the chat kind of lighting up with like, we can't see. But I thought it really important to think about the very kind of critical role. Thank you, Shelley, for the thumbs up. Of diversity, equity, inclusion in health communications. As I think back to the office space that Shelley described, I remember, particularly when I was on the communications side of the house before technically in the diversity space, I remember a colleague sharing with me during a particularly stressful time. She said, "Soon Me, no one dies because of PR." And as I think about health communicators, I don't know if that is really true. Sure, we may not be surgeons or in the ICU or on the front lines of healthcare, but there is so much about what health communicators do that really is life and death. That shows up in the ways that we practice inclusion of our messages, the groups that we focus on, the storytelling, the humanizing of others. co-creating of solutions, the data that we collect, the analysis of that data, as well as the actions that all that work spurs. As Shelley shared, I moved into a diversity, equity, and inclusion role back in the beginning of 2017. And my perspective on diversity, equity, and inclusion is that diversity should be a part of everything that we do. It shouldn't be siloed. It's not just a part of human resources. It is everyone's job, and it must be deeply personal. Within the Omnicom Public Relations Group, our purpose statement is that diversity is a moral imperative and it's a business imperative, but not just in the sense that it's additive to what we do, but there's a concern that when we're not operating in such a way, we're actually operating in deficit. Secondly, our intention is to be an anti-racist group of organizations, and that means that we're acting with intention and that we're acting with an urgency. And thirdly, there is a critical opportunity as well as a responsibility that we have as a larger entity to make sure that we are operating at scale. All right. So in preparation for today, I started looking at some key statistics and just trying to find what people are talking about as it relates to COVID-19, and also in terms of diversity and equity inclusion as part of that. And the key statistics I found were around mask use, around variants, around vaccine adoption, but more broadly, even as we're talking about so much of the health disparities that we see, there was not actually a ton of statistics without trying to dig a little bit further. And if there's anything that the COVID-19 pandemic, along with the racial reckoning, the economic consequences, and the overall epidemic of hate that we've seen, these disparities are real. And to not, in my opinion, practice diversity, equity, inclusion within our healthcare communications is malpractice. And we see that really taking place. So to just move further along, I'd love to just share, some key statistics as it relates to COVID-19 and diversity that I thought might be worth sharing. And some of this may be new or surprising, and some may be like, yeah, I've got that. All right. So Hispanics and Latinx communities are 1.7 times more likely to contract COVID-19, so the highest. 25% of fatal police shootings involve signs of mental illness, and 54% who died as a result of harm from police were people of color. We talk a lot about women leaving the workplace. In fact, 400,000 more women than men have left the workplace since the pandemic, and it's going to take several years, if not longer, to correct that. And of course, that has impacts on longer career objectives. We hear a lot about mental health, especially amongst our youth. But did you know that 40% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered suicide in the last year? And among the transgender and non-binary youth, more than half have seriously considered suicide, according to the Trevor Project. Nurses. 30% of nurse deaths related to COVID-19 were Filipino nurses. And yet Filipino nurses only make up 4% of the US nursing population. Our Black colleagues are exhausted. They have been exhausted. And then even more recently with the Derek Chauvin trial, Dante Wright, so many other incidents that we have seen, there has been a disproportionate depletion due to these pandemics. Asian hate is a thing. In the past year, we have seen 6,603 Asian hate incidents reported specifically to Stop AAPI Hate, an organization that tracks this data. And we know that this only scratches the surface. And yet, for many, including a lot of the media, this was not covered in great detail until the tragic spa shootings in Atlanta in March, so over a year later. And specifically looking at the Asian American Pacific Islander communities, so plural, we're not a monolith. And there's such an important place for disaggregated data. Often, and the analysis overlooks the impact that other communities have had, such as Native Americans, as well as Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, who we know have been disproportionately affected. So with all of that, I'd like to actually move into what are some learnings, what specifically as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion that we can apply to the communications work that we do. All right, so the first thing that I'll point to is that we've learned over the course of the last year is the importance of systems thinking. I think until we saw and witnessed the murder of George Floyd, a significant difference that we saw ensue was that no longer could we really look at things in terms of individual acts of racism, and societally, we're now talking more, and we have been, about systemic racism. The killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd brought attention to the institutional practices of inequity, and no organization gets a pass. And particularly as communicators, we were asked to create and help our clients create statements of solidarity, to be in tune with the moment. And in that way, so many of our stakeholders, internal and external, forced us to recognize the systemic racism and then to create remedies, whether that is in terms of board and leadership composition, promotion of pay parity, representation, to achieve short-term, medium-term, and long-term equity. The second area or learning is in the area of cultural fluency. So the moment of racial reckoning really made it clear for all to see. We don't know how to talk to one another. As a society, we recognize so many of others are exactly that. They're other. They are strangers to us. And because we lack a common experience across race and ethnicity, we lack a common language. I know I personally heard over and over from different leaders, managers, marketers, I don't know what to say, and still feeling afraid today of saying the wrong thing. Too often we've sought a kind of personal cliff notes or a Wikipedia page or some type of glossary, an FAQ or talking points. But there really is no shortcut for proximity and authenticity. To lead diverse teams means we have to lead diverse lives. We know that context and nuance is everything, and the rules change quickly and applied unevenly based on our engagement with underrepresented communities over time. And make no mistake, this is not an issue of political correctness. It really is a matter of cultural competency that leads to cultural fluency. Organizations right now are learning or turning to broader learning journeys to foster growth mindsets and to drive towards progress. I think it's so important that we recognize that without these skills, we are operating in deficit. The third area that I'll focus on is the fact that everything is intersectional. So let's take a moment to recognize the time that we're in right now. May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. It also shares the month with the anniversary of the George Floyd murder. We know that in June, traditionally, we have celebrated Pride. Pride Forevermore will share that month with Juneteenth. I remember last year, as many of our LGBTQ employee resource groups were preparing for Pride, really as celebrations, all of a sudden there needed to be a pivot and a remembrance that Pride was born of protest. Pride was born from Black trans women at Stonewall who led to that LGBTQ uprising against the oppression that was being faced. I remember even recently, as it relates to Asian Pacific and actually not the month so much, but it was just after the Atlanta spa shootings. And we were developing really a week of remembrance, of healing, of understanding and action. And that week, actually, specifically, we also needed to address misogyny within the culture. Within also sharing that week was the International Trans Day of Visibility, and making sure that we were looking at this recognition through a variety of lenses. And that is the case for forevermore, I think, at least for now, that these commemorations don't just sit at a particular moment in time. They begin January 1 and they conclude December 31 and keep on going. So same thing with Black History Month. It's not just a month, it's not just a particular point in time, but it's something that we integrate into everything that we do to recognize and reclaim so much of our history that's not been celebrated or acknowledged. I want to go back to something in terms of cultural fluency, and specifically around our words. Our words matter. And just a few shortcuts that I use in my own case when I don't know exactly what to say, I try to begin with this idea of people first. I try to use humanizing language. Generally speaking, I will use colleagues versus employees. You'll rarely see me use the word minority, except in specific instances, because I don't believe that we are minor. Also, those that are traditionally called minorities, actually in the global population are the majority. So those are some things that I know for me that I try to exercise in my own case. We also know that the harm that words like Kung flu, Wuhan virus, China virus have. I heard recently a friend of mine talk about the fact that they were near a harbor or a pier where boats come in, and saw a young child point at a large shipping boat approach and with Chinese characters. And the child instinctively, or perhaps even from what they've learned, was like, oh my gosh, coronavirus is coming towards us. Again, the words that we use. We are in the midst of creating something for our Omnicom employee resource group, specifically for Asian leaders. And even there, we're very intentional about using the word leaders. We know that there's something called the bamboo ceiling exists, where those of Asian descent are considered, hey, you're great workers, but you're not necessarily leadership material. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing that. When people see the word Asian, that they also think about, what does that mean in terms of leadership, and what does that communicate? Also for me, I know that this isn't for everyone, but I don't really use the word BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. I understand the reason for that, but when I want to center Black and Indigenous communities, I'm very specific to say Black or Indigenous. Even though when we use the words killed or died in terms of our pronoun use. I'm so thankful, frankly, for so many members of the disability community who give me gentle correction. And all of those ways, I think our language can be a lie detector in terms of how we think, but also can be a corrective measure in terms of how we wish to be. So I too am not trying to be politically correct so much as that I'm trying to be an empathetic leader, and that when you know better, you do better. And this also extends in terms of our visual representation. There's the quote, if you can see it, you can be it. And I also added in there, and yes, we're counting. Our communication is happening all the time, visually as well. I know that I look for representation to get a sense of my safety and my welcome. And do I need to read between the lines here to kind of understand what the situation is? I look into, even in terms of photo stock and the photos that I choose, I recognize like, wow, there is a white standard that is perpetuated here that you have to really search to have, representation in our communications. So just a quick note there as it relates to visual representation and how critical that is as well. I want to touch on accountability. Accountability is really important as we think about the point now is it's 2021. And for a lot of the organizations that may have kind of gotten a pass last year as There was a stop to kind of self-reflect. 2021 is the year of the receipts. And it's so important that we are able to show action for all the self-reflection that we have conducted. It's so important that we've collected benchmark data, we're disaggregating that data, that we're creating these reporting mechanisms, that we're preparing to communicate frequently and upon request if needed. All of this to say is so important that we are vigilant to close the gap between what we say as well as closing that gap between what we say and what we do. And then the last thing that I'll really leave us with is the importance of being human. You know what, diversity is just not enough. It's not enough if we don't create psychological safety along the way. We've got to normalize mental health discussions as well as mental health benefits. We have to create safe spaces. There are so many things that we do to create inclusion in just everyday small efforts. When we're in a meeting, who's the first person that we call in that meeting? Often, if we call on, let's say, somebody who was underrepresented first, it completely changes the vibe of the entire meeting, increases participation. Even in terms of the pronouns, as particularly as cisgendered people, if we normalize the use of pronouns, that is something that we can do. Even in this Zoom kind of world that we live in, that can feel distant. There are ways that we can use our Zoom, even in our names, and sharing our pronouns there in terms of creating closed captioning so that it provides greater access to those who need that. So there are so many little efforts that we can do every single day that promote inclusion. So in closing, I just want to say just a few things. Diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not optional. It's not just an opportunity, but it really is an obligation. Diversity, equity, inclusion is not programmatic. It is strategic. It must be embraced at the highest levels, and it's transformational, not transactional. And more, we are seeing that diversity inclusion is including equity as part of the conversation, that it is being expanded to include justice so that the work that we're doing doesn't stay within the four walls or the virtual four walls of our organizations, but really extends so much to how we participate as part of a larger community, as part of a larger society. And with all of that, I was asked to provide a little bit of a charge to all of you that have participated in these last 2 days of this Health Communications Summit. And what I want to just say to all of you is that I want to thank you, first of all. Thank you for being on the front lines of communicating and practicing diversity, equity, and inclusion in all of your work. Thank you for practicing empathy, for being human and recognizing the humanity of others. And ultimately, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not, and it doesn't have to be these really, really tough systemic issues while it is. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is about recognizing the humanity of others and really creating that world that we really wish to belong to. So with that, thank you so much. And those are my, those are the remarks that I really wanted to share with such an esteemed, honorable crowd that I am part of today.
Thank you, Sunmi. And Ashani, I think you've been collecting questions maybe in our chat function. And so if you want to come on, I will go back off and let you go ahead and pose those questions.
Sure, I have been collecting questions. So there's mostly the chat has, I'm not on mute. Okay, good. I wanted to make sure. Most of the chat has been sort of accolades and affirmations and people responding saying, yes, that's great. But a question did come in, and the nice thing is I have lots of questions. Like, this is my jam. The stuff you're literally speaking one truth to power and speaking to my heart. So I have some questions for you as well. And also I'll just say one person earlier in the last meeting said something about, we should do a collection of quotes. And your presentation was ripe with the most wonderful quotes. And I'll read some of them back as we proceed. One of which I think comes from Maya Angelou. The first thing I'll say is, first question, I'm going to pose the one that popped up in the chat. We would love to hear your thoughts and tips on managing DEI issues and undertaking initiatives in an organization with different geographic locations and cultures. And there's a two-part, and different DEI fluency. So I'm thinking this is a question about what do you do when it's global, and people have different fluency in terms of their knowledge of DEI.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shani. And I'm like, oh, I want to read the chat notes because I'd love to just kind of get the sense of the spirit of what's going on. But thank you for whatever affirmation and accolades have been shared. I certainly appreciate that, and I look forward to reading that. Shani, thank you for the question as well regarding the different geographies. And I'm assuming that this means globally, but we certainly have different regions, even nationally, that we can incorporate. So I think it's so important that we do two things. One is that we recognize and meet people where they're at, but at the same time, let's not take a kind of lowest common denominator approach either. I think that I think it's so important that we understand there are some basics that we can all do. So let's just start with implicit bias. We all have it. We all have it. I know that I'm often correcting myself all of the time. And I know that there are some that might poo-poo that a little bit, is like, hey, that's too basic or whatever. It is not. I'm discovering and rediscovering the biases that I have, ingrained in me all of the time. And the more that I, take stock of that, I feel like that's important. I will also say, as it relates to our implicit biases or unconscious biases, that for those who have found that not so great, it's because guess what? Not all training and workshop is the same. I know that I've participated in ones that are like, that's terrible. I can see why people hate that. And I've participated in great ones. But even more so, I think it's important that we look at things as a part of a broader learning journey. Like, and the one-off approach is completely mistaken. There's so much that we need to learn, relearn, and even unlearn. And as part of that journey means that I think we have different ways that we need to think about in terms of our roles as well as our responsibilities. So for example, if you're responsible for talent and recruitment, there are specific things that we can do there. If you're responsible as a people manager, that's so critical to make sure that we're addressing microaggressions that we know are happening every single day. And then from a regional perspective, yes, we have to bear all of that in mind, but we actually often have more that we have in common that we don't. I remember having a conversation with some of my Brazilian colleagues, and I was thinking oh, here's what I'm going to share from the US. I'm not sure if this is going to be completely relevant. It's very, geared towards the civil rights movement that's happening here. And I remember the response I got back, which was actually, Sumi, this is super relevant because in Brazil, it's 55% of our population are Black Brazilians. And then also in the UK, I remember here no, we're really more about, let's say, gender issues are really, really important for us. And so I'm yep, totally understand that. And guess what? I've also been told by folks within your organization that race ethnicity issues are actually very critically important and haven't been perhaps overlooked. So I think there's often more that we have in common that we don't. So that's just, I'll say just some simple things that I'll mention for that question.
That's so perfect. I'm so glad you say that. I work in an organization that is global, and I've often heard when I'm talking about DEI, they'd be like, well, diversity, equity, the perception of, or not perception of, the reality of diversity is different in the US than it is globally. But you just brought up two excellent points. One in Brazil, in terms of what's happening there with the Black population, and then also in the UK. So thank you for that. That's excellent. Another question I have is that you said early on that sometimes people don't know what to say, like with the racial reckoning, right, in the US, and people are like, oh, I don't know what to say. A question I have for you is what do you advise to help facilitate allyship among people? I mean, you did use the language people first, which I thought was perfect, but I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. What do you do to encourage and facilitate allyship?
Yeah, I think one thing, just even speaking about language, we have to adopt, I believe, more of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And Carol Dweck has a really great book on that. And like, I wish I had adopted or knew of this when my kids were younger, because I think I would have been a better parent versus like, you're so smart versus like your actions are, you know, are, I really appreciate your effort. And I think that would have created like greater like sense of trying, right? So I think that's true of where we are right now as well, particularly as allies. I don't know why, like folks think that they should be, I don't know, have that like A+++, you know, rating as it relates to allies, when there is so much that we have to learn. And it's like anything that that we need to learn. I mean, I think back, I'm really embarrassed about my education, and I don't fully even blame myself because, you know, the way that history is taught here, I'm relearning things like right now that I should have learned as a child, as a student. And so, you know, so much of that is just being really, really intentional about our, you know, learning journey that we've been talking about. But also like, let's make mistakes. And that's the way that we learn. Like, we don't have to, I don't think have to have shame about that. I think people, generally speaking, like honor intention and earnestness. So, I mean, that's what I would, you know, probably say there is just, hey, we have to at least try. I don't think just being perfect in silence is really the answer.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. It's like embracing the fact that that people make mistakes. So that's wonderful. Thank you. You mentioned a book, and I don't remember the author you just said, but related to that, I know that I had on my paper that I wanted to ask you the specific question about any books that you recommend reading on DEI in the workplace or cultural fluency.
Oh gosh, so many. So Ashani, let's see. I love this book. It's called Just Us, Claudia Rankine. And I love it because it's like even just the texture of the pages, or that there's like visual aspects of it too. I love everything about it. So that's one. There's another book by Kathy Park Hong, which does a really great job of kind of explaining the Asian American experiences, brings in the history, but also, you know, issues at play. That's called Minor Feelings is another one. This one I haven't read yet, but I really want to, which is, of course, from Ibram Kendi and Jason Reynolds, called Stamped, and it's meant for youth.
Yeah.
And so I haven't read that yet, though I've started reading Stamped from the beginning, which is more kind of the adult version. But what I love about Stamped is I'd listened to this interview with Jason Reynolds, and something that he says, like, I did not want to write this book. I did not want to write this book, but, you know, Ibram Kendi kept bothering me to write this book. And finally he did. And he said, you know, the only reason that I did it, because, you know, he knew how hard it would be, is because I go into this thing with having the same intention of everything, which is like, I want my babies, or these babies, like, I mean, the youth, I want them to know that they're loved, that there are people who care about them, and there are adults who care about them, and they might not know it yet, but they're out there. And I just thought that was I love good intention, the best intention. So that's something that's on my list to read amongst a lot of others. So those are a few that I'll mention.
That is wonderful. I'm sure all of the participants appreciate that. Before I ask this question that has just popped up in the chat, have you read Cast by Isabel
I
Wilkerson?
have read Cast.
Yeah.
Yes.
I finished and I know it's not about the workplace, but I just thought it was excellent. I finished it a couple weeks ago. It was great.
It's brilliant. I have to say, I love Isabel Wilkerson, because she just, again, brings in the history that I feel like I should know, but she just, you know, brings it into a new light. I think she's such an important writer.
Yeah. The connections she made with different caste systems, I thought was excellent. Yeah. Okay, a question that came up in the chat that I want to pose to you. What are some common barriers to DEI advancement that you have experienced throughout your career? I love this. This is like a personal question also. With existing leaders that others may be experiencing in their own roles or in their own companies. And second part, how did you overcome those? I'll stop there for the moment.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that was, as soon as you said it, I'm like, easy. The biggest barrier are good people. And everyone thinks that they're a good person. And good people are I kind of equate it with the white moderates that Dr.
Mhm.
Martin Luther King Jr. talks about,
Mhm.
and just the fact that it's that other people's freedom and is something that can wait, that can be, pursued at the right time when there's never the right time. I think it's so important when I think about like what it means to be a good person is just not good enough. And I think it has to be like really, really, really personal. So how do we overcome that barrier? Yeah, how do we make it personal? I know within my own organization, something that I'm doing right now is like, I know that the senior most people within my organization have to fully embrace this. And I know they do, so many do, but how do you make it even more so? So we're embarking on something with Dr. Gregory Ellison at his organization, Fearless Dialogues. I'm a big, big, big fan. And yeah, to make sure that we know the specific power and influence we each have in our specific roles, and we all have that power and influence to make this more of an urgent and critical matter.
Oh, that's excellent. It sounds, those words you're using sound very akin to like people being very well at power dynamics and how that plays out in workplaces. Thank you for that. Well, that is the last of the questions I have for now, and I know we want to leave sufficient time for there to be a closing. I can't thank you enough. This was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ashani. It was so great to be with you all.